All right, well, to discuss the impact of the COVID-19 coronavirus across the continent, we're now joined by the SABC's foreign editor, Sophie Mokoena. Sophie, thanks very much for joining us. So, for a while, Africa had been the last bastion, the last place where this virus was coming, and it was coming very slowly, few countries, particularly to the north of the continent. But it's quite clear now that there is no region that's free from this virus. Let's try and get an update, a sense of where we are. Should we start in the north? Because that's where it started really for on the continent.
You must remember, Peter, the World Health Organization, the regional institution on the continent, did warn that it is going to be very difficult for the sub-Saharan countries when this virus is reported, particularly on the continent. We knew that it was going to be difficult because of the type of health system we have in sub-Sahara, but also the issue of movements of people and goods, which at times you can't control. But secondly, those countries, the developing countries on the continent, particularly a country such as Egypt in the north, you look at Nigeria and you look at South Africa. These are also transit points, you know, where business converge and people converge, but also in terms of tourism. Therefore, let's start in the north. In the north, you have Egypt that is having many numbers, and today South Africa has actually taken the first spot, and now Egypt is number 2. Egypt has tried to introduce measures to ensure that they deal with this issue. They've closed the airspace. They have decided to stop planes in and out of that country. They've also requested people to stay at home. They've really taken very serious military measures to ensure that they deal with this virus. You go to the West Africa, you have a country such as Burkina Faso. Because of its systems, we know years back, not very long, there was a coup there, and therefore the health system has collapsed, and it's very difficult for them to kind of rebuild the health systems. But also the relationship with Europe, particularly a Francophone country, you have traffic from, you know, in and out of that country, people from Europe. You know, we have stats coming from Europe. Currently, Europe is the epicenter of this virus, and therefore that movement is affecting Burkina Faso in the West. But Nigeria, one of the most populous countries on the continent, has got a serious problem, the numbers, the population, but also movement of people. And Lagos in particular, where you have many people, there were even reports that upon hearing that Donald Trump is certain that people can look at using the malaria vaccine or malaria drugs to deal with issues of coronavirus. People started doing that, administering medication for themselves, and now you have people who have been poisoned by this malaria product, and therefore you have a problem already there. You come to East Africa, you have Rwanda leading. Why Rwanda? I think Rwanda because it is a country that is vigorously developing itself, and you have lots of movement of people and goods and services in that country, particularly people from Europe to invest in that country, as President Kagame is on a drive to ensure that you have lots and lots of investors. Also, you know that the issues of conference in that country is one of the main pillar of the economic pillar in that country, and therefore you have many people visiting Rwanda. You come to SADC, you have South Africa number 1, not only in the region but also in Africa, and that is why we expect the president tonight to come up with very, very tough measures.
All right, so let's talk about SADC, and we've got our borders that link us to each other, and there's talk about what we can do. A lot of these smaller borders have been shut already to funnel places where proper screening and testing can happen. And I guess we're going to see more activity in terms of how, A, to secure those borders, but at the same time, try and find a way to balance the movement of economic and commerce.
I think movement of people is going to be restricted. You may still have issues around trade, you know, having some way or leeway to deal with issues of trade, but generally movement of people is going to be restricted. The sad thing is that when you look at countries such as Swaziland, Lesotho, Zimbabwe, they are really depending on South Africa. And if we close borders, we put more strict measures, that's what South Africans are calling for, it is going to be very difficult for those countries. Therefore, we'll see tonight how the president is going to navigate this problem of borders. I mean, you look at Gauteng, when you look at the numbers 402, the epicenter in South Africa is Johannesburg. I mean, we know this is a transit point, particularly people traveling by air. You know, your OR Tambo, for me, it's one area where you really have to find a way how you manage that entrance to South Africa via OR Tambo. And therefore, you go to other provinces, I think it's when people are moving inland, but to the issue of Free State, we know where the problem started, that church, and therefore the president has to come up with strong measures. It is going to inconvenience us, it is going to inconvenience business, it is going to be very tough, but he has to, he has to.
I mean, air travel has been one industry that's really has been massively affected. We've just seen Dubai International shut down for 2 weeks. And to give people a sense of just how important this is as a hub for travel, 82 million passengers passed through Dubai International last year. Many of those South Africans. So that is just going to affect the whole continent, really.
Yes, United Arab Emirates is very important to South Africa in terms of trade. The Emirates airline going to different parts of the continent. Unfortunately, it's not going to happen. I mean, Dubai is a transit point for many people going either to Asia, you go to East Europe, you go to America. That's where people get their connecting flights. Whether you want to go to Cuba, you either go Dubai or perhaps Europe. And therefore, the countries or the areas where you have airports that are used as transit point or where you can get your connecting flight are very vulnerable. And Dubai, it is one such country, like South Africa on the continent, like Ethiopia. We saw yesterday Prime Minister introducing some strong measures and also cutting flights, the Ethiopian airline. And today you look at Kenya completely shut down of the aviation business, because they are aware that the aviation business can cause problems for countries, particularly in terms of exporting this disease to their respective countries. And therefore leaders are saying, let's shut the airspace.
All right, let's quickly talk about Zimbabwe, because even before this COVID-19 coronavirus, the healthcare system there was already under enormous strain. And the fear is, if this epidemic in Zimbabwe goes at an exponential rate, they just won't be able to cope.
Well, Peter, let's take a case study of the person who has passed on. This is a person who is not as poor as many Zimbabweans are. This is a person who would have money to get the best medical treatment he can. He traveled to US, came back via OR Tambo to Zimbabwe. Therefore, it speaks to, if those who have are so vulnerable, what about ordinary people looking at the infrastructure in that country? Earlier on, we had a discussion in terms of unpacking who this person is. And under normal circumstances, with all the resources the person has and people around him, he could have gotten the best of the best in terms of treatment in that country. But he was vulnerable. You can imagine the situation in Zimbabwe right now. A few months ago, we were constantly giving Zimbabweans update around the collapse of the health sector in that country. And therefore, I think Zimbabwe is in for a terrible time. And we know that the World Health Organization has warned that the health system in Zimbabwe is in a crisis. But also, World Food Program has warned that there's hunger, and because of poverty in that country and the economic situation that would include even natural disasters such as the drought and also the many people had experienced problems already. They have experienced problems already, and therefore you know better when we talk about Zimbabwe. It is no surprise that in the SADC region when we talk about a country that is currently reporting a person who has died due to coronavirus, we're talking Zimbabwe, and now we don't know.
Yeah, and then more domestically, we've got two countries with unique situations being immersed in South Africa, Lesotho and Eswatini. What's the threat there? And they can't go forward without talking to South Africa because by and large they're engulfed by us.
I think people kept on asking why the president is delaying. It is such reasons. Because South Africa is a better economy in the region and also on the continent. You have to take lots of issues under consideration. When we really close completely South Africa down and no one is allowed to have access to our country, you are already creating a problem for such countries that are dependent on South Africa. And I think before making major announcement, the president did take that into consideration. He has consulted his peers in the region, in the SADC region. But secondly, he is the chair of the African Union. We have forgotten that he's currently a chair of African Union. He has to also give direction, not only to South Africa, but to the entire continent. What are we supposed to do under these circumstances? Many countries are looking to him now to say, in Africa, what are we supposed to do? And therefore, there's a lot of work that President Ramaphosa has to do, but also internally to ensure that these areas that are seen as perhaps epicenters of this virus, you have to do something. Lockdown, lockdown, lockdown. We know that based on the Chinese experience, looking at what's happening in Italy, there is just no way. You have to introduce the lockdown system.
All right, so a lot to consider, domestic and foreign policy. We'll probably get to hear a little bit later on. Sophie, we'll leave it there. Thanks very much indeed for your insights as always. Thank you.
Thank you.